Welcome to NCIX Tech Tips. Today we have a very special episode with a very special guest. This is Dave Burks, and I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit here.
Thanks, Linus. I'm a product marketing director at Seagate Technology. I focus on hard drives.
Hard drives, because that's what Seagate makes. All right, so today we're going to be discussing specifically hybrid hard drives with a special emphasis on the second generation of Momentus XT product from Seagate Technology. Now, I mentioned this was the second generation of Momentus XT products, so why don't we take a look at how Momentus XT, that is a hybrid hard drive SSD solution, compares with the other players in the market, which are pure hard drives or pure SSD-based solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, most people are familiar with hard drives. They've been around a long time, probably going on over 30 years. But hard drives are rotating memory, where you've got a platter that spins and a head that reads off that media. And SSD drives are solid state, so it's a memory chip where your data is stored on that memory chip, and as a result, it's very, very fast. It's one of the fastest storage technologies out there. So what we're doing in a hybrid drive is we're combining the best of a hard drive, which gives you a lot of data at a low cost, putting some solid state on there to give you speed, and ending up with something that gives you near SSD speeds for less money and a lot more capacity.
Okay, so what is near SSD speed?
Well, we'll actually show you a chart here. This is we've come up with a new measure that we call the fast factor, and the fast factor is a measure of a combination of things that really people care about, which is how fast does your computer boot, how fast does it load files, and how fast does it go in general. And you can see here the third column over is our new Momentus XT drive, which is going to be released on November 29th, and it really comes very close to SSD speeds. It's quite a bit faster than a traditional hard drive, a little bit slower than a traditional SSD, but for a lot less money, and so it really is the best of both worlds.
Well, the kicker to me here actually is that these numbers are not representative at all in some ways, because you've got you've used a competitor's hard drive, that's interesting, but we've got a Hitachi 7200 RPM drive here, and then we've got an SSD here. Now the difference in performance for multitasking particularly, this is probably single tasking, I would say. These are individual benchmarks. For multitasking, I'd expect that SSD to be more like here, and then I think it really sells the Momentus XT short to present it this way, because the Momentus XT will actually separate itself far more from the hard drive than it will from the SSD in a multitasking scenario. So you talked about fast factor, but why don't we talk about, you had a fast technology, I forget the term.
Yeah, well, we use the term fast factor technology, but we should talk about that in the context of the fast factor technology. But if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of solid-state drives for a minute.
Sure, okay. So hybrid drive history, this is kind of an interesting thing. So it's kind of a why Seagate question, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's funny that this hard drive history you have here has a lot of Seagate technologies and Seagate products on it. Is there a reason for that?
Well, yeah, you mentioned a while ago that our Momentus drive is coming into its second generation, and to be honest with you, we could really call it our fourth generation, because our first hybrid drive was actually back in 2007. And you know, they say that you get good at things after failing a few times. Well, to be honest, our first attempt at hybrid drive technology was not a great success, and the reason is that we didn't integrate all the intelligence required to do a good hybrid solid-state drive in the drive itself. We were depending on a lot of data pass-throughs to the operating system. In this case, it was dependent on Vista, you know, telling us where we needed to buffer information, and so that just didn't work out. It wasn't a tight enough integration. So we moved to our second generation in 2008, and we actually never shipped this drive. And the reason is that the architecture proved out our fundamental process going forward, but we didn't have quite enough flash in there to get the performance that we needed, and so we increased that. In our first generation Momentus drive in 2010, it shipped at 500 gigabytes and 320 and 250, and the 500 is really the mainstay. That's what everybody wants. And it's got 4 gigabytes of SLC flash in it, and it really, really just shook up the world in terms of this technology.
So tell me something then. Why wasn't second generation fast enough? Was it purely to do with the amount of flash? Was the flash too slow? Was the flash technology there not there yet?
Well, there was two primary improvements that we figured out in between those two generations. The first one was we did determine that we needed a little bit more flash to really buffer the data that we needed to buffer. The second one was that we began to perfect this technology called adaptive memory technology, which is essentially the secret sauce in making this go so fast. Because let's face it, we don't have that much flash compared to the hard drive. And so the secret is to make sure that the data that you need to access most of the time is in the flash. And that's where the speed comes from. And that's what adaptive memory technology does. It actually learns, based on your behavior as a computer user, what files you need most, and it keeps those in the flash. And that really speeds things up.
So 4 years and 4 generations of products, even though they didn't all ship, mean that Seagate probably has more experience than anyone else in this SSD caching space.
I'd like to think so.
Now, there are other solutions on the market, but, okay, for example, Intel has their Smart Response technology, which requires you to have one SSD drive, a hard drive, and then a Z68 chipset board. OCZ has their Synapse drive, which comes with special software. It's a special SSD, and then you have to have a separate hard drive. Now, I believe that Seagate's solution is the most elegant, and I think consumers should care about that because, and this comes back to a little anecdote that I was actually telling you earlier, but I'm going to tell it for the benefit of the audience. I believe that is more important to consumers than almost anything else. My uncle's business partner actually got a MacBook Air right when they came out. And I was visiting over there and I was doing some benchmarking on something, and he came up to me and he said, you know, I really don't know why you use a PC anymore. I got the MacBook Air. It's, you know, it's got a slow CPU. It doesn't have much RAM, but man, this thing's fast. It's fast. It boots up so fast. It comes out of sleep instantly. And he pulled it out to show me. It comes out of sleep instantly. I said, okay. So I put my notebook to sleep. And then I opened it up and it came back on instantly. He said, wow, how did you do that? I said, well, it's got an SSD in it. It's not magic. It's a special ingredient. So Momentus XT, and we'll get into the spec in a moment. I'm not going to ramble forever here, you guys. But Momentus XT gives you that SSD snappiness, and it really does. I have experienced it firsthand in one package. So how'd you guys do that?
Well, I think, you know, what you mentioned is something that Apple is famous for, which is integrating things into one user-friendly, very elegant, you know, package. And so when you look at the other alternatives that are on the market, they do work to a certain degree or another, but I believe they're either a little more clumsy, a little more complex, maybe too expensive. And so what we're doing is integrating this tried and true technology in SSD, which is very fast, but we're doing it in a way that gives you really the best of all worlds. You get the speed, you get the capacity, and you get the price that is much better. You
can actually put it in a notebook too.
You can, you can put it in there as a legacy type of product or storage module that the operating system knows how to use from day one, right?
Okay, so speaking of that, so how transparent is a hybrid drive to your OS? Or like we have people posting on our forum from time to time. Can I put 2 Momentus XT drives in RAID? How do I install an OS onto a Momentus XT drive?
Well, you know, they use the same basic command set as a normal hard drive. So our adaptive memory technology that I mentioned earlier, it's the guy that keeps track of what you need to use most. In fact, we've now got some new elements of our specs that we call fast factor technology, and this is more ingredients into how to make the SSD and the hard drive combination in a solid state hybrid drive faster. So our fast factor flash management, that's just a way to make sure that we write as infrequently that flash as possible, because flash memory is subject to overuse and wear out conditions. So we manage that very carefully. And then our fast boot technology makes sure that all the information you need for your boot is always in that flash module. So it's always going to boot up exactly like you described in that scenario where your uncle brought his system out. And then finally we have our fast factor write technology, which minimizes the times that we have to take the information from cache and write it to the hard drive information. That saves power and it makes things go faster as well. So in general, we're continuing to iterate on the technology to make this really the best of, as I said several times, of both worlds, a combination of your SSD and your hard drive.
Now, in terms of spec upgrades, the new Momentus XT is going to be bigger, so it's going to be 750 gigs versus 500 gigs in terms of user storage. it's going to have 8 gigs of SLC flash versus 4 gigs of SLC flash. Remember, SLC is the expensive flash. That's the one that can be written lots of times, so it's going to be very durable. It's now SATA 6 rather than SATA 3 gigabit per second. And all this other stuff is pretty darn similar, although the average read-seek times are down a little bit, and the average write-seek times are up a little bit. So here's the summary right here. Now, all of this hybrid talk is all fine and good, but I would suggest that perhaps when you take two technologies and combine them into one thing, a hard drive has its weaknesses, it's mechanical, it's subject to failure. An SSD has its weaknesses, it doesn't have any moving parts, but it will fail eventually due to the way that they wear out. If you put those two things together, aren't they more subject to failure?
Yeah, that's a great question. As it turns out, though, you put SSD and hard drive together and they complement each other really well. And here's why. As you mentioned, SSD has its weakness in that the write cycle is much less than a traditional hard drive. And so if you write to an SSD over and over and over, eventually you'll wear out those cells, and so that's where all this high technology stuff in the firmware about sparing and stuff comes into play. On the other hand, the hard drive is subject to failure just because of its electromechanical component. Well, when you put these things together, you're not using the hard drive as much, and you're not writing to the SSD as much. You're mostly reading from the SSD component, which is great because it performs great in the read, and you're taking those write cycles and reducing those. So you're actually compensating for both of the weaknesses in these two technologies, and that's what makes them a great complement.
Oh, that's fascinating. So by loading things into the SSD only after we use them a couple times, we're reducing the writes there, but we can read from it all we want. Remember, reading doesn't wear out an SSD, but reading can wear out a hard drive. But if we take all of our most frequently accessed stuff, read it once, throw it onto the SSD once.
It's a great story.
Well, I think that pretty much covers our Momentus XT coverage, so big thanks to Dave for coming out and being with us. And say hi to the audience, or bye at this point, I guess.
Until next time.